Thank you so much for presenting such a great Botkin lecture.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I had a blast.
So we were interested in...
It's always wonderful to get an audience to, listen to this stuff.
That's right, yeah, and we had a pretty good venue for it today, I should say. So, yeah, so we were interested in some of the areas that you touched on, especially some of the people that you've worked with over the years, and you used a phrase that I thought was great, which was vernacular professors. And explain that phrase, and is it your creation, or have you heard it from others?
I don't know. It just made sense to me. People like Dewey Balfa, who, I had many hours of, ongoing conversations with him about the way things are and how things work and who's who, what's what. He's the one who came up with this concept of having the first festival in a place where people couldn't dance. Mm-hmm. And my initial reaction, that was like, it's dance music. What are you, nuts? And he said, no, if they're dancing, they're not going to be paying attention the same way. Wow. Wow. That's worth tuition.
Yeah.
Right? Or what Ben Guinet did. Ben Guinet did, turning his chair around to tell me those stories when he realized that the audience out there, he wasn't sure they understood his Creole. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know how they were reacting to this, but he knew me. I had spent hours with him on his porch, so he just turned his chair around and started telling me the story. And I thought, wait, this is working way better. Yeah. Right? Where do you get an idea like that? You get an idea like that from somebody renegotiating the context, or instinctively, or in a folklore class, a theory class, where they're saying, how could we
Yeah. No, and what's interesting about it too is, so as you explained the story, he was on a stage doing storytelling, which is not the natural context necessarily for those kinds of stories, but you were on the stage with him. And so to reorient to you was actually giving that audience more, an experience that was more like how those stories would normally be
They got
told.
to peek into what would typically happen on his porch. We weren't on his porch, but he had renegotiated as much of that as he could. I saw something similar at the Festival of American Folklife. I forgot what year it was, but Ray Hicks was there. Yeah. Great storyteller from Appalachian. And they had him on a stage. It was a small stage, but nevertheless it was a stage with a microphone. And it just wasn't working. He felt uncomfortable, and the crowd didn't know what they were doing there. And so the next day, before his session on the stage was scheduled to happen, he was over there leaning against a tree telling a bunch of people some stories, like which he really felt more comfortable doing. Happily, the stage producer, stage manager, saw that happening and said, oh, okay, never mind this thing. This is completely useless. Just went over there and put a lavalier mic on him and a little speaker nearby. And it just enhanced the sound a little bit. And instead of telling stories for 5 people, he told a story for 15 or 20. But he felt comfortable doing that. So, I guess my point is, if folklorists are paying attention, the lessons are there.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Dewey a little, because I've interviewed a bunch of Cajun musicians, Michael Doucet and Steve Riley and all those folks, and all of them say, oh, well, without Dewey, none of this would have happened. They all studied with him. He really was a professor in that sense.
He really
they
was.
all went to study with him. So talk about the importance of Dewey, if you would.
Where to start?
Because I didn't know that you'd been so influenced by Dewey personally, which is great.
When I went and knocked on his door, sent there by Roger Mason, what happened was when I went to knock on his door in Tipitate at his house, a lot of people had come by that point. Roger Mason and Ron and Faye Stanford, and there was a lot of people who had come in, musicians and folklorists and other folks. But not anybody from home yet.
Right.
And so he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from near Lafayette." He said, "Come, you're not going away." He thought, "You're not going away. You're going to be here. I can ride this horse for a long time." And he was always very open to people coming in from the outside, Tracy Schwartz and all these people who came in from the outside. But I think leading up to the first concert in 1974, he began to make important contacts with local folks. And I'm not just talking about Robert Jordell, who was, just interested in playing music with him, which was already a big deal. But I'm talking about what Dewey often called the people who determine things, the movers and shakers, the people who could make inroads in the university or festival programming or television programming, or he was keenly aware that there are some people who have access to those things, and if he could jig them in.
Was he that way throughout his life?
Oh yeah.
And all aspects of his life?
When I met him, I don't know how far back it went, but you see, he was recorded by Rensler in '64. But by then, he had already been playing with his own family band and also Nathan Abshire and a few other people. So he had a public performance persona. But in '64, something remarkably different happened. He became introspective, aware of what was going on in a way that I don't know no other musician was aware of it that way. Mm-hmm. And it had a lot to do with what he and Rensler talked about. Mm-hmm. Ralph saw in Dewey a willing participant in this conversation. And I mean, Dewey was the first, one of the first Cajun musicians that anybody ever heard explaining a song or explaining where the band was or explaining what they were doing. And his own brother, Will, would often say when they came to play the festival, "Oh, Dewey va parler." Dewey's going to talk. That's what he does. Well, he had learned to do that. Mm-hmm. And Will didn't do it. Nathan didn't do it. None of those other people did it. Dewey did that. So he was already sort of aware, kind of plugged into the notion that something remarkably different was happening, was available to happen. And that drew young people like Michael Doucet and me, Nick Spitzer, a lot of other people to him because he got it. He was very intelligent. He didn't have a lot of education, but he was extremely intelligent. I mean, he saw what the issue was. Mm-hmm. He said, "Oh, that's the nerve. There's the nerve. I see it."
What was his teaching like? I mean, how was it to be sitting there with him? And
well, teaching about what's going on or what kind of strategy might need to be developed for, I don't know, presenting a festival or something like that was conversational. Anybody who learned music from him, it was much more, regimental.
Right.
I mean, he said, he used to use the metaphor of the corner post, where the basic fingering for the fiddle. This is where you start. Everything goes back to this. Start here and come back to here. This is the corner post. So the way that he learned music, the way that he taught music to people like David Greeley and Steve Riley, he said, "Look, play it this way." And David Greeley is the same way. David Greeley learned from him, and he's the same way. He said, "No, I didn't say do this. I said do this. You're doing this. I said do this." He also had at the same time, a very flexible notion of what was being done. I mean, if you sang, if you sang words to a song that weren't the way he would have sung it, I never saw him have a problem with that.
Who was his mentor?
He learned from his family. He learned from people that he was playing with. Austin Pete and some of the people that were playing, Nathan. But I don't know that he had what one would call a mentor.
Yeah.
No, I think he made this up. It's just, he intuited it.
And how old was he when you met him?
Oh, I don't know. A lot younger than I am now. He wasn't an old man. I guess he was in maybe his late 40s or so.
And it's also interesting how probably part of his transformation into such a force in Cajun culture came from interacting a little bit with outsiders, you know,
absolutely.
and Ralph being part of that. So explain how his connection to Ralph Rinsler and to Newport and all that may have helped in this process.
Well, you know, it's interesting to remember that Dewey went to that first Newport Festival in 1964 as a last-minute replacement on guitar. And he ended up playing the guitar so much. He wasn't used to playing guitar, and he ended up playing guitar so much his fingertips were numb and bleeding. But you have to wonder what might have happened. I guess eventually it would have happened anyway, but you have to wonder what might have happened if you know, the guy who was supposed to go on guitar had gone, and if he had been willing to get on the plane, what would have happened with Dewey? I think Dewey had already been recorded. He had already met Ralph, and I think he had already had that epiphany, you know. It's like, oh, something's up here. Something potentially interesting and powerful is up. But when he got to Newport, I mean, he saw what happened. And, you know, he was a terribly quick study. He got it. Oh, I get what's happening. I get this. I see what's happening. Because already that first year at Newport, he noticed, you know, the Tommy Jarrells and the Monroe Brothers and you know, all the other people who were there performing. He said, oh, I see what does that. I see what makes that crowd. Oh, I get this. Little faster, a little fancier, you know, perform a little bit, you know, public performance, public persona. He figured it out right away. And he also heard them talking to the crowd. He heard the presenters doing it, but then he heard them doing it too. And thought, oh, okay, I could see where that would be useful. They don't know who I am. They don't know what this is. Just help them understand who we are, why we're doing this. I mean, within the first year, he was already doing that.
Yeah, and it's like he came back as a combination of a musician and a presenter.
Yeah, absolutely. He came back, the way he put it himself was, he said, I wanted to bring home the echo of that ovation, of that applause that we heard at Newport. I wanted to get people from South Louisiana to hear that our music was appreciated.
Yeah, what did that mean to someone in South Louisiana at that time?
Oh, I mean, in the early 1960s, when that happened, you know, Cajun music was appreciated by a segment of the population, but by other segments of the population it was considered old and passé and raucous. I mean, look, in 1965, a guy named Burton Grindstaff, who did a column for the Opelousas Daily World newspaper, heard that they were what he called talent scouts from Newport in the area, looking to bring take musicians up there with them. And he wrote in a column, what an embarrassment this would be. I mean, he said there's music, there's Cajun music, and then there's you know, music, and they don't have anything to do with each other. He said it's like cats fighting under the porch. And he made a prediction. He said, it would be terrible and embarrassing if one of those talent scouts took some of these recordings that they're making back up there and they got a faulty needle and heard it wrong and thought it was good and invited us up there. What an embarrassment we would be. Well, it turns out it wasn't an embarrassment at all. It was exactly the opposite. So, there was a prevailing notion among certain segments of the society that this was, well, they referred to it as nothing but chanky-chank. It was considered old and passé, and with the Americanization process, it was precisely something that Cajuns should be trying to get away from, run headlong away from. And Dewey said, well, no, they're loving this up there. Like, why wouldn't we love it? Why can't we appreciate our own treasure? When he started talking to Jimmy DiMaggio, the chairman of the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, about Cajun music, it happened before '74, a few years before. Codafil was created to restore French in Louisiana, to preserve and restore French in Louisiana. And Dewey understood that, language and culture are not separatable. I mean, language doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists to express things and culture. And so he started trying to talk to Jimmy DiMaggio about incorporating local Louisiana French cultural effects into this effort to try to preserve and promote the French language of Louisiana. And DiMaggio was not a Cajun music fan. He was more like the Burton Grindstaff bunch, He liked jazz. He liked New Orleans, Dixieland jazz. And he thought that the only Cajun music he had ever heard was, raucous and kind of out of tune and played by a bunch of drunks or I don't know what, something. And Dewey was talking to him. He talked to him over a number of occasions. And he said, you don't like this. You think you don't like this because you've only heard it poorly played. Mm-hmm. If you heard it well played, you would change your mind. And DiMaggio, of course, would blow him off. Oh, I don't know about all that. You Balfa boys want to try to bring that raucous stuff in. Well, at one point, Dewey, Balfa, and Léo Leblanc, who was the representative of the Quebec government in Lafayette, helping Codafil to conceptualize what it was doing. Léo Leblanc was a guitar player from New Brunswick originally, and he understood Dewey's message. And he and Dewey blindsided DiMaggio at a party just outside of Lafayette, between Lafayette and Carencro. They were at somebody's camp. And he said, oh, that's one of those Balfas that's always talking about that damn Cajun music. And he said, I got my fiddle in the car, and Leo has a guitar. Let me play you something. And Dewey played. Of course, Dewey was great, right? Dewey plays this stuff, and DiMaggio said, wow, I never heard anything like that. And that was the beginning of the flip. Mm-hmm. Just a short time later, DiMaggio accepted the idea to produce that first concert. By the way, did you ever hear about how that happened?
Tell us.
It started out to be a demonstration to 150 French language journalists from all over the world who happened to be having their convention in Lafayette. And Codafil, DiMaggio was concerned that he wanted them to write positive things about the presence of French language in Louisiana. He didn't want them to write about, this whole thing is dead. And so he was trying to figure out ways to present them some local culture in French. And up until then, Codafil had been very cerebral. It had been top down. It had been, imported French from France. And Dewey kept saying, we have this stuff from here. We could show him. And after he heard that performance, that impromptu performance at the camp, he said, well, maybe so. So we started talking to him, and I had worked on the Smithsonian Festival in '74, so I kind of had a notion of, I had met Ralph, and we started working on this thing. And Codafil representatives and DiMaggio accepted to do this concert. But it was supposed to be a very, very low-key, small format thing.
And where was it taking place?
Well, it was gonna take place in a theater on campus, like a seating capacity of about 350 or 400 people. It was for the journalists. It was just gonna be a demonstration of Cajun music to them and Creole music. Then we started, as we were working on this, we thought, maybe some people from the public might be interested in coming. So we decided to open it up a little bit to a nearby ballroom, and then to a larger venue, the municipal auditorium, which was seated about 3,000. Because we were getting feedback from the public. Yeah, I might want to see that. And then we ended up with the Blackham Coliseum, which had a capacity of 12,000 people. But DiMaggio at that point got cold feet, and he said, "Man, if we do this in there, and it's half full, it's going to look half empty. It's going to be a lot of empty seats." I don't know why, but I felt like, I think this is going to work. I think it's going to work. I was all in. Like, on the poker table, I was all in. And we ended up doing it there, and Léo LeBlanc, that same Léo LeBlanc, was writing press releases. Sitting out in the newspaper, getting people kind of excited about this. But honestly, we had no idea if anybody was going to come. We didn't. I didn't even know if the musicians were going to come. We weren't paying them anything. And we were talking about Clifton Chenier and the Balfa brothers and Nathan Apshire and Boisek and Kenray, and and we didn't know if any of them would show up. And then that day, it starts pouring down raining. I mean, cats and dogs. There was 1.5 feet of water on Johnson Street right outside of the Coliseum. I thought, oh, well, there's it. If this goes bad, I'm done. I'm just moved to California or something. I'm going to be done here. Well, about 4:30, the schedule will start at 7. About 4:30, Lionel Leleu, Boisek, Ardouin, and Kenray, and a couple of ballad singers showed up. Their pants rolled up above their knees, walking through. Where do we plug in? Well, this may work. Something's going to happen. Sure enough, everybody showed up. The people start coming. It's still raining cats and dogs. People pouring in there. Filled the place up. I thought, oh my God, this is way. We had set up. Can you see this? If you think of this as an oval, we had set up the stage here, so that even if we just got 2/3 of the crowd, it wouldn't look so bad, because they filled backstage too. Filled everywhere. The whole place was surrounded. I said, look at this, and it went off. It was an amazing night. Energy. People were hearing this music for the first time that way, and you could tell there was a buzz. People were talking, and so I went to DiMaggio backstage and I said, "You owe me an apology." He said, "I don't apologize to anybody," but I said, "But you were right. This is amazing." And that's what started. That's what plugged Dewey Balfa into the local community in a very serious way. He became an icon for us. That had already started happening at Newport and Chicago and other National Folk Festival and those other places, Smithsonian. But
he was sort of an icon of Cajun music to the outside, and then he became.
He really hit stride after that.
Yeah.
Can you explain, when you were growing up, were you aware of Cajun music? How was
sure.
Cajun music, how was your family structured, or where did they fall in the community?
My dad was a barber. My mother was a beautician. There was always hair on the soup in my room. But working class folks, and
Was there music in your family?
no, nobody played. My father whistled. That was about it. But he was a great whistler too, man. He couldn't carry a tune vocally to save his soul, but he could whistle like amazing. But no, we would hear Cajun music, go to a wedding dance, or sometimes we go out to a party somewhere and somebody was playing. We had some records. Daddy's favorite record was the Irie Lejeune reissues.
Yeah.
And we heard Aldous Roger and the Lafayette Playboys on Saturday afternoons on television. And, you know, it's just something that was always there. We weren't all that, I mean, to be honest, you know, we had the Beatles and Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones and all that other stuff going, Chuck Berry and all that other stuff going on, right? So that was really the bulk of our musical world. But there was this stuff, and it was ours, and I enjoyed listening to that as much as anything else. Didn't do it as often until I realized, oh wait, this is us. This is what we have. This is the treasure that we need to value.
Mm-hmm. And your early training, and you mentioned that you went to Indiana originally to study French.
I did.
French literature as opposed to folklore. So that was the angle that you first came to it from.
Yeah, I got to tell you,
apparently.
you know, for me, studying French after that 8th grade class, studying French was really the path of least resistance. It was lazy. It was the lazy way. I mean, it was easy for me. I spoke French from home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I walked into a classroom and I already knew it was a plume and papier, and the doigt, la bague, la main. I knew all this. I knew how to. Nobody had to teach me how to do the passé composé. I
Right.
knew how to say, I ate something yesterday.
Right.
So what I had to figure out was two things. One, how to write and read what I already knew how to say, but also how to negotiate a place for the local vernacular into the larger scheme of the way the French language works in the world. That ended up becoming one of my cheval de guerre over my career. I didn't want to declare independence for Cajun French. I wanted to force the French to accept us at the table.
Yeah, I mean it makes sense as a strategy in the sense that French is a huge force in the world, and why separate yourself from that if
Yeah.
you could join it?
And early on in that, it was the going was pretty tough because, you know, the French can be very kind of close-minded about what French is.
Sure.
You know, hexagonal, as they say.
Yeah.
And it was with the eventual explosion onto the concept of la francophonie, where, you know, there were lots of countries in the world where French was spoken, but not necessarily like France, and their references were not French. They were West African or Northern African or Belgian or Quebecois or Louisianan. And once that notion of a larger context for French in a francophone world emerged, it enabled places like Louisiana to figure out a way to preserve our own specificity, the way because, you know, the business about preserving French and teaching French in Louisiana, what's the point unless it's the French that produce those songs and stories that we value so much? I mean, right? That was not an easy go in the beginning. I mean, I remember people from France would come to visit us, to visit this sort of, you know, I don't know, linguistic museum or something,
Right.
linguistic living museum, and we would say something in French, and they would say, "Oh, ça ne se dit pas," you know, that's not said. And we finally learned to say, "Oui, ça se dit, je viens de dire." Of course it's said. I just said it. And then they would say, "Oh," well, they figured out, well, you know, it may not be politically correct to, you know, judge like that. So they started saying, "Oh, c'est intéressant, comment vous dites ça." It's interesting how you say that. Then we learned to say, "No, here it's not interesting at all. Here it's usual. Here you're interesting." And like, it turned the tables on, especially people from France. But two things, two people I often quote in that regard. One, ironically, is Nicolas Sarkozy, the former president of France, who said, referring to la francophonie, that its biggest weakness was that it was the only one who didn't recognize its own strength. If you understand.
The only one of what? I'm sorry.
La plus grande faiblesse de la francophonie, c'est qu'elle est la seule à ne pas reconnaître sa force.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Right.
La francophonie doesn't recognize its own strength.
Everybody else recognizes it, but
Yeah,
la francophonie
right.
does not. Right. Yeah.
And what he meant was, it's actually a sign of strength, this diversity, this linguistic diversity. It's not a sign of French being deteriorated.
Right.
On the contrary, it's a sign of French being enriched by all these variant contexts. And the other is a novelist, a Québécois novelist, who wrote Le Couteau sur la Table, Jacques Godbout, who wrote in the preface of that novel, Nous nous reconnaissons tous dans cette francité, de Dakar à Montréal, à Paris. Mais, au lieu d'être français, nous préférons être nous-mêmes en français. Instead of being French, we prefer to be ourselves in French. And therein is precisely what, what I think we were after in Louisiana.
Yeah, that's a great quote. So, being yeah, go on.
Interestingly, I didn't talk a lot about the French side of it. I talked about the folklore side of it, but the two were, in my mind, in my experience, the two are inextricably linked. It was all part of the same thing, and that same thing was finding and recognizing and valuing that ourselves, who we are, and how we speak and what we do, how we sing, how we dance, everything. It was all part of the same thing. And the French language was a part of that. In fact, I sometimes got accused of being so attached to the French expression of things that I was kind of turning up my nose at some of the groups in South Louisiana who were singing in English. And I said, guilty as charged. I mean, it is a French thing.
Yeah.
For me, I mean, I'm not saying other people should not do that, but for me, that was what I was interested in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that when folklorists approach something like a French diaspora, one of the tendencies is for them to try to trace stuff back to France, just because of the sort of valuing things that are very old. If you look at Dewey's early recordings, a lot of the songs that he did have connections to France, and I wonder if that was organic to his repertoire or if it was part of his recognizing that that's what would play well with Codophil and other organizations that were interested in.
Well, I'm not sure that the second was his motive. The first was one of his motives, but the other thing, he was interested in what was profoundly us about those songs, and a lot of us was really old stuff. He enlisted the help of his brothers and other people, his sisters, his aunts, to mine the family tradition for the oldest songs they could remember. Sometimes unaccompanied songs like "Je me suis marié, j'ai du crédit," and so he was trying to reach as far back as he could, but he was also valuing contemporary creation, as long as it seemed like it was in a flow, a recognizable flow. But what you said about, sometimes people get stuck going back to France, we did, and it was sort of like a self-defense mechanism. The French keep saying that, some of the stuff we say are represent an erosion of the language. But we started looking into it, and it turns out they weren't erosions at all. They were preservations of the way things had been said, except that you had to go to the exact provinces, Poitou, Vendée, Charente, those areas where the original settlers had come from. If you go there, they still refer to a coffee pot as not une cafetière, but une grègue, like we do. So, and they still, conjugate the imparfait ils avions instead
Yeah.
of ils avaient.
Right.
So we weren't making mistakes. We were preserving the way, some of the things that we had inherited from our origins. And sometimes those were songs. Now,
Right.
now, one of the reasons why the Lomax collection was so profound, it was a watershed moment when we heard that. And one of the reasons was that up until then, our notion of the way Cajun music had evolved was based on the commercial recordings. Those were as far back in history as we could go. And we had been all profoundly influenced by Chris Strackwitz's historical re-releases, going back to
Right.
the late 20s and 30s and 40s, and he was sort of putting it into a sort of a historical sweep. And it made sense, right? There was this early stuff, and then there was the swing band influence stuff, and then there was the war stuff and the post-war stuff, and so that made sense, and it was telling a very compelling story. Then the Lomax collection stuff, like, whoa. A lot of the stuff was way older.
Yeah.
It was recorded in 34, but the Lomaxes were looking for people who were representative of pre-commercial recording stuff. All of a sudden, we started thinking, oh, wait, man, all these ballads, all of this lyrical treasure of lyrics that come from way far. And a lot of the stuff you could actually connect through Quebec and Acadie all the way back to France. I mean, we had to rethink the whole thing. And sometimes one of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to this stuff was, hey, I recognize that theme. I recognize that mal marié theme.
Yeah.
The
But
narrative,
in the ballads, it was elaborated with 4 or 5 verses, where it intricate. Whereas in the dance music lyrics, it had gotten compressed. It got tight and compressed and impressionistic. But that's obviously where it had come from.
Yeah. Yeah, so you have the new compositions actually coming out of these older traditions
Right.
that
Or
you
people
hadn't
people
realized.
who were at least sort of conceptually aware of them, if they weren't word for word, but they were
Right.
addressing the same themes,
Right.
In your talk, you were very eloquent about new creations coming in, just as you're saying now, as kind of a part of a tide that keeps going, a river that keeps going. Can you talk a little bit about your contributions to that?
Mine. In what way?
Well, I mean, let's talk about Jean Ancelet.
Well, if you hang out with those guys long enough, you kind of think, hey, I'm interested in doing that. I could
You
do
mean in
that,
actually
right?
writing, just for the
Yeah.
record? Yes.
Yeah, so the first time I did that was for Wayne Toops. He called me one night and said, I got this song I want to do, but the lyrics are in I wrote the lyrics are written down in English, but my notion of it is in French. Could you come and help me? And so I went and I developed the lyrics for Un Amour Secret, which was the first song. And when I heard that, I had a moment not unlike Dewey's at Newport. I was in the studio watching that happen. Next thing you know, this whole band is playing and he's singing lyrics that I just came up with. I thought, I love this. This is really great. Man, this is really cool. So,
You did it as a pseudonym, though?
yeah.
Yeah, and why? Can you just talk a little bit
Yeah,
about that?
the pseudonym is older than that. You want to hear this?
Yeah, sure.
Jean Arsenault was born when Barry Ancelet was 27 years old in Quebec City. I was in Quebec for a Rencontre des Peuples Francophones, large international gathering of Francophone people, hosted by the Quebec government. Quebec used to do this a lot because I think they wanted to sort of reassure themselves that they weren't alone in this.
Yeah.
And so they would bring in Acadians and Louisianans, and sometimes people from Missouri, other French-speaking Ontario.
Yeah, they wanted to be sort of the capital of French America.
Yeah,
in a way,
and they wanted to kind of say, we're not alone in this effort, So there was this rassemblement in 1978, and I was there to give a talk on the integration of Louisiana French style of speaking into the classroom. And when I got there, we learned that there was a literary event, a poetry reading. It was called Paroles et Musique. It would be poetry readings and music. The part of the music side of it that they were going to present was the symphony orchestra of the city of Quebec was going to debut a symphony piece that Claude Léveillé had composed in honor of Anne, Samuel de Champlain's wife. So there was a symphony orchestra on stage, and there were these poets. Quebec had a long history, Gaston Miron and Michel Alon and all of these, long history of poetry used as social fuel to protest being drowned out, to protest, like Michel Alon, Speak White, that kind of. And so they were having this literary event, and we learned upon arriving there that they had forgotten to include Louisiana, and it was like a gaffe, what can we do? Well, nobody in Louisiana at that point that I knew was writing poetry in French. I mean, there were people who had written songs, and Zachary Richard, my dear friend from home, had written some new songs, but I don't know that anybody would have thought of it as poetry. It was, but
yeah.
So I'm talking to the organizer of this thing, Marcel Dubé, and he says, this is a terrible, embarrassment. We have to include Louisiana. Well, it turns out that I had written a few poems in reaction to a woman that I had met earlier that year in Moncton. Originally from Quebec, but she was living in Moncton. Kind of been smitten by her, and I wrote a few things about her. And her name was Louise. And there was an opportunity to sort of make a confluence of Louise and Louisiana as a potential mistress that you're
Muse.
your muse that we were smitten by.
Yeah.
So it was like a Louisiana, it was like being in love with your place, and so there was a confusion. So I didn't want to force his hand, after we finished this thing in Quebec, I was on my way back over there to see if how that was gonna play out. So I had these things I had written about her, but I wasn't intended to show anybody. But he's pressing me, so I said, well, I have this friend. I didn't want to force his hand. I said, I have a friend who has written a few things, and he said, well, let me see. I said, I happen to have some here, and so I showed him. And he said, who is this? I said, his name is Jean Arsenault. My name is Barry Jean Ancelet, and my grandmother was Elia Arsenault, so I mean, right there, as fast as that. He reads this stuff, and he said, oh, this is perfect, you'll read this. Call him and ask him for permission. So he hands me a phone. This is 1978. This was before cell phones or answering machines or any of that. So I called the number at my apartment in Lafayette, knowing nobody was there.
Right.
And I had a conversation with Jean Arsenault as the phone was ringing in my ear to get his permission, because by then I was caught in my lie, to get his permission to do this. So I hung up and he said, it's okay. So he said, well, you read this. And then I thought, wait, Zachary Richard's here. He's here to perform in a concert. He had big hits. So I went over to where the concert setting was going to be, in the Plaine d'Abraham, and Zachary Richard already by then was a big thing in Quebec. It would be like going to some big festival in England saying, "Hey, I need to talk to Mick Jagger." Right. Like, yeah, right, sure.
I'm his friend from home.
Yeah. I'm his friend from home. Right. I'm his buddy. Yeah, right. So I told the guard there, I said, "J'ai besoin de parler avec Zachary Richard." Yeah, He said, "You and about 500 other people." I said, no, I really know him. He said, "Yeah, the same 500 other people." But while we're talking, over his shoulder, I see Ralph, Zachary Richard, come out of his roulotte, the trailer. And I knew, because he went by Zachary Richard, but we all called him Ralph from back home. So I knew the only way I could get his attention was I yelled, "Hey, Ralph!" He turned around and he said, "Oh," he said, "what are you doing here?" And he told the security, I said, "Let him in." Security guard. So he let me in. So I said, "Look, here's the deal. They want us to participate in this literary thing, evening. And I got one thing, but I need something else. Do you have any songs that you haven't yet recorded that we could claim as poetry?" He said, "Yeah, I have a few things." So we picked La Ballade de Beausoleil. Okay. And those are the two things that I read that night. And there were about 3,000 people in the courtyard of the Petit Séminaire in Quebec. I had never experienced anything like that in my life. I couldn't have dreamed it. And got a standing ovation, I guess in large part because people were so astonished that this existed in Louisiana at all. But I was really, I had a moment like Dewey. I said, "Oh, man." So I got back home, and I called Ralph, Zachary Richard. I said, "Man, you're not going to believe what happened. I read these things," and he said, "Man, I know. It happens to me all the time." I said, "No, but your singing is different. When you're singing, it's different." I was just speaking these words, and it electrified the whole place. Me too. I said, "Okay." I said, "We have to do this here." It was the same principle. We have to do this here. So we organized a series of Parole et Musique in Lafayette. And I had so much fun with Jean Arsenault, I elected to keep him around. And so all of the literary things that I wrote and published, poems, song lyrics, stories, whatever, I published under the pseudonym of Jean Arsenault.
And how many collections did you publish, or under that name? There were
6 or 7.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of song lyrics.
Yeah.
All of the song lyrics I did for Wayne Toops and Richard LaBeouf and Steve Riley and even D.L. Menard and a few other people. They were all done under Jean Arsenault. Great. And Floyd Swallow at Swallow Records in Louisiana said, you need to tell people who you are, man." I said, "No, man, this is so much fun. I'm having a blast." Because Jean Arsenault, when Jean Arsenault would show up for a poetry reading or a performance, he could look really different.
No one can tell it's you?
I would often wear a Mardi Gras mask.
Uh-huh.
Did your colleagues at the university know you were involved?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, after a while, it was the worst kept secret in French Louisiana. But nevertheless, it was fun because it was kind of like having a stage persona that was able to play out there where there was no stage. I mean, it was in real life. You could, Jean Arsenault could show up and the other thing about Jean Arsenault was that Jean Arsenault never had to worry about English. He never had to deal with English. He was exclusively French speaking. Right. One time, when I was doing the KRVS morning show that Pete Bergeron does now from 6 to 7:30, I did an interview with Jean Arsenault. I would just ask a question. I would just ask a question and then answer it. And I didn't even change my voice. Just ask a question and then answer it. And so people started calling the studio and say, "Hey, I want to talk to that guy. He wrote the lyrics to Wayne Toops' thing. I want to talk to him, see if he could." I said, "Well, hold on a second. Hello."
And no one could tell.
It was so much fun,
That's great.
And you started performing as him also? Are you singing now?
Well, Sam Broussard convinced me to use my real name. on that CD.
Yeah.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the CD. The title of the CD was,
Broken Promised Land,
and when did that come
which
out?
was based on Promised Land where Ben Yene was
Yeah.
telling stories. Huh?
And when did that come out?
A couple of years ago. What is 2016?
Uh-huh.
And I didn't even know we were making a CD. I thought we were just goofing around in Sam's studio, his studio at home.
Right.
I had written a bunch of lyrics. He started putting them to music. And at one point he said, hey, I want you to sing on some of these. I'm like, really?
Had you sung before?
Happy birthday. And no, I used to sing a little bit at the Liberty. You know, I would sing every once in a while. And I sang with the Wandering Aces, Lionel Lula and Don Montese for a little while. I used to have a little bit of a voice. I don't have one anymore. I told that to Sam. I said, all I got is this gravelly thing. And he said, that's all you need for this. Because it's sort of bluesy stuff. Anyway, so we record, but I thought we were just playing. And after about 10 songs, he says, well, you know, what are we going to do with this? What are we going to do with what? He said, well, we got 10 songs. Really? Okay. What could we? He said, we could put out a CD. I said, how would we do that? He said, we could do it ourselves. I said, I don't want to be in the CD business. He said, well, let's pitch it to somebody and see if they would put it out. So we talked to Joel Savoy first about it. He said he was too busy. So I went over to Phil Platt, talked to Floyd and Chris Swallow about it. I got to tell you, I went in there with all 10 songs, and I said, Floyd and I have known each other for a long time. I said, Floyd, I got to tell you before you hear this. I said, it's different. It's like real different. He said, it's okay, I could do different. Okay, so he starts listening to it. And listen, y'all, I'm serious. I'm not making this up. They listened to all 10 songs in a row with not a word. I was like, oh, man, this is a train wreck. Whoa. And at the end of in the 10th song, pushes the pause button, and he says, well, Ancelet, when you said it was different, you weren't kidding. But he said, I tell you what, we're going to put this out, because I don't want to be the joker that didn't put this out. Yeah. So he puts this out on Swallow Records, sort of routinely. You know, they send most of the stuff that they put out in a year for consideration to the Grammys. The damn thing gets nominated. I thought, I got that call one morning. I was still in bed, and somebody said, you know, your CD has been nominated for a Grammy. I said, what are you saying? What are you saying? And I said, yeah, no kidding. In the regional roots category, I thought, oh, man.
And if I'm not mistaken, it was up against one of Joel's projects.
I participated on that one
right,
too, so I was double nominated that year.
But I'll bet he was sorry that he hadn't said yes to you at that point.
Might have been. Yeah, we were competing with, and then Roddy Romero's album was also, we were 3 from Louis.
Yeah.
We diluted our own vote, but that's okay. I felt like being nominated, I won anyway.
Yeah.
They gave me a medal and everything.
Yeah, that's just a great acknowledgement for what you've done over the years and for the culture in general. So.
Okay, but it was more of a surprise for
Yeah.
me. Nobody was more surprised than me. Sam was not surprised. He thought, you know, this is, you know, different and an important step.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I got to say, over the last 4, 5, 6 years, I have seen the bar just steadily rising on new production. Feu Follet, Bonsoir Catin, the Lost Bayou Ramblers. I mean, it's amazing what's happening, what's coming out of South Louisiana right now. And one of the amazing things is the quality of it, the cleverness of it, but another thing is that it's still in French.
Yeah.
It's still coming out in French. Like,
well,
I'm happy about that, but I'm kind of surprised.
One of the things that we love about it here at the library, and I know you've talked about this a lot and will continue to talk about it, is the fact that those groups are still using our archival resources as their inspirations. That is,
Absolutely.
they're recording just like Michael Doucet was doing 25 years ago or 30 years ago, and Steve Riley was doing 20 years ago and 15 years ago. They're doing it now
And
and recording versions of our songs.
You know why? You know why Michael Doucet was the first? He got the jump on the project because when I brought back the Lomax copies to home, to the university, he and I were sitting side by side, listening to the tape. There were 11 reels. We put on the first one, started listening. It was Wilfred Charles, a jure singer, but he was by himself from New Iberia. Got through that song and he was singing about Zydeco in 1934. I thought, whoa.
Yeah.
I pushed the pause button. I turned to Michael and I said, "Man, we're gonna have to rethink everything we thought we knew. It's a game changer."
Because it was so much earlier than
It was represented so much an earlier tradition. That first song, that guy was singing about Zydeco, and everybody said Zydeco emerged in the 50s. Well, what was he doing singing about it in 34? And he wasn't the only one. There were two other songs
There were
that
some other
mentioned
ones,
it.
yeah.
Right? And then we started hearing all that Hofbauer stuff and you know, the stuff coming out of New Iberia, the stuff coming out of Crowley. It's like, whoa, the lyrical richness that we were hearing was stunning. So what do? I start thinking, okay, how do we keep this going? Lomax had said, Alan and or John had said as a tagline on a number of those cuts, you know, we're recording this for the Library of Congress so that it will be available to musicians in the future, blah, to learn. I said, well, let's see that, let's do that. So I started calling people in and said, hey, you want to hear something interesting? Michael had started doing it already, and people were asking him, where'd you get that? It's in a Lomax cut. Really, where's that? So they would come into the archives and say, musicians were like, can I hear that? And they were starting to pick songs and recycle them. Mambo Playboys, Fifole, I mean, you name it. Anne and Savoy and Jane Vadrine, and a number of people. So next thing you know, there's all this bubbling of brand new old songs.
Yeah.
Well, it's great for you to bring it back to the library today and just to give us an overview of what you've been doing, what's been going on in the area. We could go on for hours, but I think we need to
But I want to say, by the way, on the record, I want to say on the record that the
thoughts?
Library of Congress and the American Folklife Center has been so generous and supportive of all of this and enabled so much of this to happen. We appreciate what you all have done for us.
Well, we absolutely appreciate everything that you've done for the music. One last point that I'll make is I've worked with those Louisiana collections, and the cataloging, the additional cataloging that you guys have done is actually better than what was done here in the 30s and 40s. So there's songs that we can find out about that are in our collections that we can only find out about through your work.
Josh Caffrey did an amazingly meticulous job of identifying some of this stuff and finding out information about the backstories a lot of times. I mean, I had started that ball kind of in, discovering a few things, and then Josh, took the handoff and ran for a touchdown.
We keep his book in the reading room as one of our basic resources when people come in to talk about that material. So, thank you so much for the talk and
pleasure.
for talking to us in this
coming to
interview.
Washington. Yes, it's been lovely.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.